There's a laugh America instantly recognizes, bright, bubbly, almost weightless. The kind of giggle that makes you assume the person behind it has never known a dark day in her life. And for decades, that laugh became a shortcut, a symbol, a promise. If she is smiling, everything must be fine. But the truth is, that laugh was never proof of peace. It was proof of performance. Behind the iconic blonde curls and the sunshine energy, Goldie Hawn was fighting panic, so intense her heart would sprint like she was running from something real, something chasing her, until she genuinely believed she was dying. While millions watched her glow on television in body paint and bikinis, nobody saw the same woman later, alone, in a quiet bathroom, crying under the shower so the water could hide the sound. That contrast, joy on camera, terror in private, wasn't an accident. It was the story of her entire life. Because long before Hollywood labeled her the happy one, there was a little girl learning a brutal lesson in a ballet studio. You can be talented, you can be disciplined, and still be told you're not enough. From the time she was tiny, Goldie was pushed into ballet, less because she begged for it, more because the adults around her believed it would create a future. Ballet became her second home. Mirrored walls, corrected posture, relentless repetition. Again, again, again. In that world, praise was rare and criticism was currency. Your body wasn't a body. It was a problem to be fixed, a shape to be judged, a flaw to be pointed out. And over time, the mirror became both teacher and tormentor. She wasn't the kind of ballerina the era rewarded, not the fragile, rail-thin illusion the industry romanticized. And when you're a young girl staring at your own reflection while adults tell you, directly or indirectly, that you don't fit the blueprint, you don't just learn discipline. You learn shame. That shame didn't stay in the studio. It followed her into adolescence, into school hallways, into every room where people assumed blonde meant shallow and smiling meant easy. She was visible enough to be noticed, but not understood. Boys projected onto her. Girls dismissed her. And inside, something was quietly forming that she didn't yet have language for. Anxiety. It started as a tight chest before performances, a sudden nausea before exams, a strange sense, for no obvious reason, that the world was too big and she was too small to survive it. She didn't call it panic. She didn't know the word. She just knew that sometimes her body would betray her and she had to pretend it wasn't happening. By 16, she made a decision that felt like destiny. She would pursue dance professionally. She enrolled in school, trained constantly, took gigs in small productions, chased every audition she could find. This was supposed to be the part where discipline pays off. But the professional world didn't reward her effort the way she thought it would. Again and again, she heard versions of the same message, sometimes said politely, sometimes with a smirk. You're not serious enough. You're too blonde, too bouncy, too much. As if energy was a flaw, as if brightness was proof of stupidity. Every rejection carved deeper until she started wondering if the mirror was right. If all the work and discipline and pain were never going to be enough because she didn't look like the version of legitimate the industry had already decided on. And then came the moment she would later carry as both shame and survival. At 19, she became a go-go dancer. Not in some glamorous venue. In a loud club where the floor was sticky with spilled beer and the attention wasn't admiration. It was hunger. She wore the outfit, the boots, the short skirts, and she smiled because the job required it. After years of ballet training, years of trying to be respected, she was reduced to decoration. Something pretty to look at, something to consume. Some nights, she caught her reflection in the club's mirrors and felt bile rise in her throat. Not because she hated dancing, because she hated what it meant. The feeling that she had been pushed off the path she trained for, into the role people always assumed she belonged in, the blonde cliché. But here's the twist Hollywood didn't tell you. Those go-go platforms taught her something ballet never did. How to command attention without apology. How to be watched and still keep power. How to take the exact things people mocked. Her body, her smile, her too much energy, and turn them into tools, not weaknesses. By the time she was 22, she was still scrambling. waiting tables between dance gigs, living in cheap apartments, auditioning constantly, hearing, "We'll call you," so many times it started sounding like a joke the universe kept repeating. Then an audition appeared that didn't look like destiny. It looked like a paycheck. A new comedy variety show was looking for dancers. It wasn't prestigious. It wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't the kind of thing serious artists bragged about. But Goldie had learned something the hard way. You don't turn down work when you're trying to survive. She walked into that audition with her anxiety humming under her skin like exposed wiring. The room was full of dancers who looked more polished, more connected, more confident. She expected to disappear in the crowd the way she always had. And then the music started. Instead of clinging to ballet precision, she let herself go. She moved with the uninhibited energy she'd been forced to develop in rooms where judgment was constant. She smiled. She made eye contact. She didn't try to be perfect. She tried to be unforgettable. And in that moment, something snapped into place. The very traits that made her wrong for the ballet world were exactly what made her magnetic here. She got the job. In 1968, she was hired for Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, a show that would explode into a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. And suddenly, Goldie wasn't just working. She was being seen, but not the way she wanted. Because the minute America met her, they didn't call her talented. They didn't call her strategic. They didn't call her smart. They called her adorable. They fell in love with the giggle, the curls, the bubbly confusion, until the character swallowed the person whole. And while the country laughed, Goldie went home after tapings and collapsed into a kind of private terror nobody ever filmed. The panic attacks intensified. The fear deepened. The pressure became suffocating. And that's where part MOT ends, because the next chapter isn't about fame making her happy. It's about fame trapping her inside a stereotype, and the moment she decided she would destroy that stereotype from the inside out. Fame didn't arrive gently. It crashed into Goldie Hawn like a spotlight she couldn't turn off. When Laugh-In premiered, it wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural takeover. America couldn't get enough of the psychedelic sketches, the rapid-fire jokes, the chaos. And right at the center of that storm was Goldie, giggling, dancing, painted in flowers and peace signs, delivering punchlines in a bikini. The country adored her. Hollywood labeled her. And neither one asked who she actually was. They didn't see an actress. They saw a character. A harmless, non-threatening cartoon of a woman who existed to be enjoyed but never taken seriously. The more Goldie tried to show intelligence, the more the audience laughed because they assumed it was part of the act. What looked like success on the outside felt like erasure on the inside. The panic attacks grew worse. Sometimes they came minutes before the cameras rolled. Her chest would tighten. Her vision would blur. She'd grip the edge of a sink, counting her breaths, praying the trembling would stop before someone called her name. Then she'd walk back on a set, smile wide, and giggle on cue. That giggle wasn't joy. It was armor. Producers leaned into the image. The costumes got smaller. The jokes got dumber. The camera lingered longer. Goldie understood exactly what was happening, and she let it happen anyway. Because after years of rejection, being wanted, even for the wrong reasons, felt safer than being invisible. But while the audience saw a dizzy blonde, Goldie was watching. She studied the comedians around her. She paid attention to timing, rhythm, structure. She learned how jokes were built, how moments landed, how laughter could be shaped. She didn't complain. She didn't rebel. She prepared. By 1969, Laugh-In had made her famous, but fame didn't come with respect. When awards season arrived, the show was celebrated. Others walked on stage to accept trophies. Goldie sat in the audience, clapping with that familiar smile, understanding a brutal truth. She was part of the success, but not the credit. That night, something inside her hardened. If they were going to underestimate her, she would make that mistake impossible to ignore. She didn't storm offices. She didn't demand recognition. She did something far more dangerous. She decided to act. The audition for Cactus Flower should have been predictable. The casting room expected the Laugh-In persona to float in, breathy, bubbly, harmless. What walked through the door, instead, unsettled them. Goldie arrived prepared. intensely prepared. She had studied the script until she knew it cold. She worked with coaches. She stripped the character down to something raw and human. She didn't play cute. She didn't play silly. She played real. When she finished reading, the room was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't happen when people are bored, but when expectations have been shattered. Someone reportedly asked, "Where did that come from?" Because this wasn't the airhead America thought it knew. This was an actress. Filming the movie terrified her. Surrounded by seasoned performers, Goldie was convinced she'd be exposed at any moment, that someone would stop the shoot and realize she didn't belong there. But when the cameras rolled, something clicked. She wasn't pretending anymore. She was present. She blended timing learned from comedy with emotional truth learned from pain. The performance was funny, but it was grounded. Vulnerable without being weak. Sweet without being stupid. When Cactus Flower premiered, critics didn't just praise her, they re-evaluated her. Reviews called her a revelation. The narrative cracked. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Oscar nomination morning. Goldie was asleep when her agent called, shouting, "Best Supporting Actress." At 24 years old, the girl who had once danced in sticky clubs for survival was suddenly standing alongside Hollywood's most respected names. The anxiety returned immediately. What if it was a fluke? What if she didn't deserve it? What if this was the moment the world realized they'd been wrong for the wrong reasons? On Oscar night, she sat in the audience, heart pounding so hard she thought others could hear it. Where a category was announced, time slowed. And then it happened. Her name. She froze, then stood, then walked, almost floating toward the stage. The acceptance speech was raw, barely held together, and one line cut through everything. "I want to thank everyone who said no, because you made me say yes." The dumb blonde had just won an Oscar, but victory didn't bring peace. Because Hollywood didn't know what to do with a serious Goldie Hawn. They wanted the giggle back. They offered roles that recycled the same joke with different costumes. Bimbo secretaries, ditzy girlfriends, comic decoration. Goldie turned them down. She had proven she could act. Now she needed to prove something harder, that she could choose. And that choice would cost her comfort, security, and eventually her personal life. Because as her power grew professionally, the cracks in her private world widened. Success didn't protect her from loneliness. It amplified it. And the next chapter of her story wouldn't be about awards or box office numbers. It would be about love, betrayal, and the painful realization that winning publicly doesn't mean you're safe privately. Winning an Oscar should have been the moment everything finally settled. For Goldie Hawn, it did the opposite. The statue didn't buy her safety. It didn't erase the label Hollywood had already glued to her. Executives still saw the giggle before they saw the talent. Scripts arrived that felt like rewrites of the same joke. New titles, same disrespect. And Goldie understood something most actors learn too late. If you wait for Hollywood to change its mind about you, you will age out before it ever does. So she made the boldest move of her career. She didn't just star in Private Benjamin. She produced it. At a time when women were expected to be grateful for roles. Any roles. Goldie stepped behind the curtain and took control. The decision was risky. If the film failed, she wouldn't just be an actress who misfired. She'd be proof that women couldn't lead, couldn't produce, couldn't be trusted with power. Hollywood laughed quietly. Then the box office numbers came in. Private Benjamin became a massive success. Over $100 million worldwide. Goldie earned another Oscar nomination, this time for Best Actress. The laughter stopped. The industry had to face an uncomfortable truth. The woman they dismissed as lightweight was now a force. She wasn't just surviving the system. She was learning how to bend it. But power on screen didn't protect her off it. While her career surged, her personal life quietly fractured. Goldie had married young, believing love would stabilize the chaos she carried inside. Instead, success introduced a new imbalance. Partners struggled to stand beside her without feeling eclipsed. Resentment grew where support should have lived. Her second marriage, to musician Bill Hudson, began with hope and humor and shared dreams. They had children, Oliver, then Kate. Goldie threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she brought to her work. She was determined to give her kids what she'd never fully had, acceptance without conditions. But the marriage couldn't hold. As her career soared and as faded, cracks widened into wounds. Then came the betrayal. Not a rumor, not a misunderstanding, but an affair that collapsed what little trust remained. Goldie later described the moment she found out as physical pain, a punch to the stomach, the kind of hurt that steals your breath. The divorce that followed wasn't quiet. It became combative. Custody battles, courtrooms, public strain layered on private devastation. Goldie was suddenly a single mother, navigating fame, heartbreak, and children who could sense their world was breaking, even if they didn't fully understand why. At night, she would tuck them in, singing softly while tears slipped down her face, hoping, praying, they wouldn't remember the fear, that they wouldn't carry the damage forward. She was in her late 30s, successful, wealthy, acclaimed, and completely exhausted. Hollywood, meanwhile, had already begun sharpening its knives. The script slowed. The roles that arrived felt smaller. Mothers, side characters, women whose purpose was to support someone younger, prettier, newer. The message was clear: you've had your moment. Goldie refused to accept it. She kept working, kept choosing projects that kept her visible. Then came Overboard, a screwball comedy paired with Kurt Russell. Critics were unsure. Audiences weren't. The chemistry was undeniable. But what the camera captured wasn't acting. It was ease. What Goldie didn't know then was that Kurt wasn't just a co-star. He was about to become something she had stopped believing in entirely. They had met years earlier, briefly, when she was young and he was barely a teenager. She barely remembered it. He never forgot. When they reconnected, neither was looking for rescue. Both carried scars from failed marriages. Both were wary, and that's why it worked. Kurt wasn't threatened by her success. He didn't compete with it. He didn't need to dominate or diminish her to feel whole. He showed up quietly, consistently. He listened. He stayed. He met her children and didn't try to replace anyone. He simply became present. For Goldie, that presence was revolutionary. She had spent years believing love meant pain. That commitment meant eventual betrayal. That happiness always came with a hidden cost. Kurt dismantled that belief without speeches or promises. He just didn't leave. They never married. On purpose. Marriage, for Goldie, carried too much history, too much failure, too much fear. Kurt understood. He never pushed. Their relationship wasn't sealed by paperwork. It was sealed by choice. Every day, for decades. Together, they built something rare in Hollywood, a life that didn't collapse under fame. But even as love stabilized her world, another battle brewed, one quieter, but just as dangerous. Aging. The industry that once consumed her youth now began treating her as optional. The offers dried up again. The expectations shrank. And this time, Goldie made a decision that shocked people more than any comeback ever could. She walked away, not because she couldn't work, because she refused to work under conditions that erased her worth. She didn't want to play caricatures of age. She didn't want to chase relevance by diminishing herself. She had spent decades proving she belonged. She was done asking. What came next wasn't a retreat. It was a transformation. Because for the first time in her life, Goldie stopped performing happiness and started building peace. And in that quiet space, something unexpected happened. The anxiety that had followed her since childhood didn't disappear, but it softened. It became something she could face instead of hide. And that realization, that pain could be transformed instead of masked, would lead her to what she would later call the most important work of her life. By the time Goldie Hawn stepped away from Hollywood, people assumed she had simply grown tired of acting. That wasn't true. What she was tired of was pretending. For most of her life, Goldie had performed happiness the way others perform roles. The smile, the laugh, the energy, the endless reassurance that she was fine. But fame never cured the anxiety that had lived inside her since childhood. If anything, it amplified it. Panic attacks didn't disappear with success. They waited, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, until she was alone. And for decades, she believed that meant something was wrong with her. It wasn't until she slowed down, until the noise of Hollywood finally faded, that she understood the truth. Her mind wasn't broken. It was overwhelmed, untrained, never taught how to regulate emotion, fear, or stress. That realization changed everything. Goldie began studying psychology, neuroscience, mindfulness, not as a trend, as survival. She learned that anxiety wasn't weakness. It was the nervous system doing its job without guidance. That children, especially sensitive ones, often internalize fear long before they can explain it. And suddenly, her entire life made sense. The ballet mirrors, the shame, the panic, the constant feeling of not enough. Instead of hiding from it, she turned toward it. In the early 2000s, Goldie did something Hollywood didn't expect and couldn't package easily. She founded the Hawn Foundation, focusing on children's mental health and emotional resilience. Its core program, Mind UP, was built around teaching kids something she had never been taught: how the brain works, how emotions rise, and how to pause instead of panic. This wasn't charity for optics. This was personal. Goldie showed up to classrooms, sat with children, listened. She saw herself in the anxious kids who tried too hard to be perfect, in the ones who smiled through stress, in the ones who thought their fear made them defective. I don't want them to feel broken, she said. I spent too much of my life feeling that way. For the first time, her pain had a purpose beyond survival. And quietly, without headlines, without box office numbers, this became the work she was proudest of. Not the Oscar, not the fame, not the legacy Hollywood wrote for her. This, as she entered her 70s, Goldie did something radical in an industry obsessed with youth. She aged honestly. No desperate transformations. No frozen expressions chasing a version of herself that no longer existed. She wore her lines openly. Let her hair go natural. Showed up looking like a woman who had lived. I earned these years, she said simply. While others disappeared behind cosmetic reinvention, Goldie chose visibility as she was. And somehow, that authenticity made her more radiant than she'd ever been. Because peace, unlike fame, doesn't require performance. Her life with Kurt Russell deepened in the quiet ways that only long time creates. Morning walks, shared laughter, familiar silences. They never needed marriage to prove commitment. They chose each other daily, through aging, through family, through change. Together, they raised children who didn't just inherit fame, but stability. Oliver, Kate, Wyatt, all three would later speak openly about what mattered most growing up. Not celebrity, not privilege, but presence. A home where emotions weren't punished, where vulnerability wasn't weakness, where showing up mattered more than winning. Goldie had broken a cycle. The little girl who once believed she was never good enough became a mother and grandmother who taught the next generation that they already were. Her days now are slower. Meditation, yoga, time with grandchildren, baking cookies badly, teaching kids how to breathe when they're anxious, laughing, not the performative giggle the world fell in love with, but the quiet laugh of someone who no longer needs approval. She doesn't miss the spotlight. She doesn't miss proving herself. I proved everything I needed to prove, she said. Now I'm just living. And that's the final truth behind the tragedy people think defines her. Goldie Hawn's life wasn't tragic because she suffered. It was powerful because she transformed suffering into wisdom. She showed that being underestimated can become an advantage. That anxiety doesn't disqualify you from greatness. That love after heartbreak isn't a myth. That aging doesn't mean disappearing. And that success means nothing if it costs you yourself. In an industry built on illusion, Goldie's greatest achievement was staying human. Not perfect, not untouched, but real. So when the world remembers her, it shouldn't just remember the laugh, the bikini, the Oscar, or the box office hits. It should remember the woman who learned, slowly, painfully, that peace is not something you perform for others. It's something you build within. And that, more than any role she ever played, is the legacy that will last. By the time the camera stopped following her, Goldie Hawn had already won. Not the kind of victory Hollywood celebrates. Not something you can engrave on a statue. She won something rarer. She learned how to live without pretending. For most of her life, the world rewarded her smile, but never asked what it cost. They laughed with her, laughed at her, and built a version of her that was easy to consume and impossible to understand. And for years, she played along, believing that if she just smiled hard enough, the fear would disappear. It didn't. What changed wasn't the fear itself, but her relationship with it. Goldie stopped running, stopped hiding, stopped believing that anxiety made her weak. Instead, she treated it like a message, a signal, something asking to be understood instead of silenced. And in doing that, she did something millions of people spend their lives avoiding. She faced herself. That's why her story still resonates. Not because she was famous, but because she was human in a system that punishes humanity. She failed publicly, loved imperfectly, chose the wrong partners, stayed too long, left when it finally mattered. She didn't age gracefully by Hollywood standards. She aged honestly. And honesty, it turns out, is far more radical. Her legacy isn't just the films. It isn't the Oscar. It isn't even the laugh. It's the permission she gives people, especially women, to stop apologizing for being complex, to stop believing that joy means the absence of pain, to understand that being underestimated doesn't mean you're small. Sometimes it means you're dangerous because nobody sees you coming. Goldie Hawn didn't conquer Hollywood by becoming louder, sharper, or harder. She survived it by becoming truer, by refusing to erase herself to stay relevant, by choosing peace over applause. And maybe that's the real lesson buried beneath the fame and the heartbreak. You don't need to be fearless to build a meaningful life. You just need to stop letting fear decide who you're allowed to be. So when the laugh fades, when the spotlight moves on, when the world stops watching, who are you really? That's the question Goldie Hawn spent a lifetime answering. And in the end, she didn't just survive her story. She rewrote it. By the time people started calling Goldie Hawn a legend, she had already stopped caring about the word. Not because she was ungrateful, but because legends are usually flattened versions of real people. They erase the trembling hands. They erase the nights when sleep wouldn't come. They erase the years when success felt like a costume that might slip at any moment. Goldie knows that version of herself never existed. What existed was a woman constantly negotiating with fear, learning when to push through it and when to finally listen. For most of her life, she chose endurance. Smile through it, work through it, outperform it. And that strategy worked until it didn't. Because anxiety doesn't disappear when you win. It waits until you stop running. One of the hardest lessons Goldie learned came late. You can be admired by millions and still feel unseen. Fame magnifies attention, not understanding. People project what they want onto you, and if you let them, you disappear inside their expectations. For years, she let them. She let them believe she was simple. She let them think the laugh meant ease. She let them reduce her to something digestible. And that compliance cost her more than rejection ever did. Only later did she realize that being underestimated was never the tragedy. Believing the underestimation was true, that was. As she aged, something unexpected happened. The pressure eased. Not because Hollywood became kinder, but because she stopped needing its permission. With distance came clarity. With clarity came choice. She chose presence over productivity. She chose honesty over performance. She chose peace over relevance. That choice made some people uncomfortable. A woman who doesn't chase youth. A star who doesn't beg for roles. A celebrity who admits fear instead of disguising it as strength. But discomfort is often the price of truth. Goldie began speaking openly about aging, not as a loss, but as a narrowing. Fewer illusions, fewer masks, fewer voices to please. In her words, getting older is liberating. You stop auditioning for love. That sentence alone explains everything about her life. She spent her youth auditioning. For respect, for seriousness, for love. for safety. Now, she no longer does. The woman who once believed marriage would save her learned instead that partnership is built in ordinary moments. Showing up, staying, listening, choosing again, even when it's inconvenient. That's why her relationship with Kurt Russell endured. Not because it was perfect, but because it was conscious. No fantasy, no illusion, just commitment without performance. As a grandmother, Goldie watches her grandchildren navigate a world louder and faster than the one that overwhelmed her as a child. And this time, she intervenes, not with pressure, but with tools. She teaches them how to breathe, how to pause, how to name emotions instead of fearing them. She's not trying to make them fearless. She's trying to make them resilient. That distinction matters. Looking back, Goldie doesn't describe her life as tragic. She describes it as unfinished, until she finished it herself. The pain didn't vanish. It transformed. The fear didn't leave. It softened. And the smile? It finally became real. Not because everything was perfect, but because she no longer had to pretend it was. If there is a tragedy in Goldie Hawn's story, it isn't the anxiety, the heartbreak, or the years of being dismissed. The real tragedy would have been never outgrowing the lie that she had to be easy to be loved. She did outgrow it, and in doing so, she left behind something more valuable than a flawless image. She left permission. Permission to age honestly, to admit fear, to choose peace, to stop performing happiness and start living it. That is not the ending Hollywood writes, but it's the ending real life respects. And now, as this story comes to a close, the question is no longer about Goldie Hawn. It's about you. Because if her life teaches us anything, it's this. The people who look the happiest are often the ones carrying the heaviest weight. The smile you see might be learned, practiced, perfected, not because life is easy, but because survival demanded it. Goldie spent decades being applauded for a version of herself that wasn't real, and the world rewarded her for it. But every reward came with a quiet cost. The fear of being truly known. The fear that if the smile dropped, the love would disappear with it. That fear isn't unique to celebrities. It lives in ordinary lives, too. In people who keep going even when they're exhausted. In those who laugh so no one asks questions. In those who were taught early that being easy makes you lovable. Goldie's story isn't powerful because she won awards. It's powerful because she eventually stopped confusing approval with worth. She learned, slowly, painfully, that being admired is not the same as being understood. And that peace doesn't come from winning the room. It comes from no longer auditioning for it. She didn't defeat anxiety by pretending it wasn't there. She didn't heal by becoming fearless. She healed by becoming honest, by allowing herself to be complicated, aging, imperfect, real. And that's why her ending matters more than her rise. Because she didn't burn out. She didn't collapse. She didn't disappear trying to stay young. She stepped back on her own terms and built a life where the smile no longer had to do the work. So here's the real takeaway. If you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever been reduced to a version of yourself that felt too small, if you've ever smiled just to keep the peace while quietly falling apart, you're not weak. You're practiced, and practice can be unlearned. Goldie Hawn didn't just survive Hollywood. She survived the belief that she had to be something else to be loved. And once she let that belief go, everything else finally made sense. So before you leave this video, ask yourself one thing, honestly. Who are you when you're not performing? And what would your life look like if you didn't have to earn your right to exist? If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Which part of Goldie's journey felt the most familiar? And if you've ever carried pain behind a smile, know this, you're not alone. Thank you for watching. And remember, you don't have to be fearless to live fully. You just have to stop hiding from yourself.